All right. Hi, my name is Don Drummond. I am performing or doing demonstrating the lecture method of teaching for my methods in teaching class at Piedmont International University. Um, have you heard of the movie Facing the Giants? I'm sure that you have. It's a small-time company that's now really a big-time company, and they made this movie several years back, and it was a really good movie. There was this kid named David. David was this transfer, had moved into the area and never played football before, and he was a soccer player and decided he wanted to go out for football because it was really the only sport that had anything to do with kicking a ball. Well, anyway, David was asked to perform this impossible task. In his eyes, it was impossible. He was a backup kicker, and the original starting kicker had gotten hurt, and it was the championship game, the state championship game, and it was really a God thing that they even got to this championship game, and it was the last play of the game, and they were losing by, 1 or 2 points, and David was asked to come into the game and kick a 55-yard field goal. David really questioned that because he had never even been able to kick anything over a 45-yard field goal in practice. He told the coach, "Coach, I cannot kick anything beyond a 45-yard field goal." And so David was just really, really freaking out about this. And the coach asked him, "David, will you give it your best and leave the rest up to God?" And David said, "Yes, I will, Coach." And so he goes into the game, and he's about to kick the ball, and the camera shifts and shows the flag in the background, the flagpole, and how the flag was flying one way, and then all of a sudden the wind stopped and completely changed directions, and the flag began to blow, and the wind began to blow in the direction that David was kicking the football, and the coach is hollering, kick it now, and so David kicks it, and he flies up in the air and lands on his back, and the ball goes through the uprights, and David's the hero. So that was just an amazing, impossible story that God took and fulfilled. And so what I want to talk about today is an impossible task. It's a little different. It's not football, but it's an impossible task that someone was asked to fulfill that looked like it was all on their shoulders, and that was Abraham. Back in the book of Genesis, if we'll start reading, I have a lot of reading. I don't know if I can get this done in my 10 or 12 minutes, but in chapter 12, Abraham was told to leave home, and God would bless him and give him make a nation out of it. So in chapter 12, verse 1, now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to the land that I'll show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now at this time, Abram was 75 years old, I believe. And so that would have made his wife, if we read forward, we'll see that she was 10 years younger than him. So she was 65 years old at this time. And they had no kids. But God is saying, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And that must have been mind-blowing to Abram. And he probably didn't understand it, but he took off and left home. And anyway, he journeyed on. And so he must have been saying, how is God going to do this? I believe God said that. I'm just not sure. But I'm going to do it anyway. So he sets out, him and his wife, his family, takes his nephew Lot with him. But we'll kind of skip down a little bit, and I think it was in verse 6, it says, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the Tabernath tree of Moriah, and the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants, I will give you this land, or to your descendants, I will give this land. So it's went now from God saying, hey, I'm going to bless you and make a great nation out of you, and I know you have no kids, but now it's saying that I'm going to give this land that you're in, that you see now, I'm going to give it to your descendants. So it's a little bit of an explanation of how God's going to fulfill this. But Abram is going to be later changed to Abraham, has got to be looking at this and saying, this is impossible. I'm 65 now. I don't really know exactly how old he was once he made it to this land. I know that it was 500 miles or so that he traveled, I think, to get to the land of Canaan. And that was on foot. Didn't have hot rods and race cars and airplanes like we do today. So it may have been some time, but I imagine he wasn't much older than 75. But he had to be seeing the impossibility here. Where God was saying, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. And he's saying, where is my descendants going to come from? So let's look at chapter 13 now, in verse 14 to 16. 13, verse 14 to 16. And so the Lord said to Abram, this was sometime down in their journey, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look at the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. So now he's not just saying, I'm going to give it to your descendants, a few, 10, 20, 100, however many you could imagine at that time. God is now saying that the descendants are going to be, in my understanding, innumerable, if that's how you say that word. Apologize if I misspoke. There's no way you can number the dust of the earth. So Abram his mind is probably blown. He probably can't understand now what God is saying. How is it going to go from me with no kids to an unnumberable amount of descendants that God says he's going to give this land to? And this is really, really tough for me to do. This is a very unique piece of scripture that I want to bring out. But if we go to, I want to talk about the fact that they're beyond childbearing years. 65, 75, and having a child. Imagine that in our day today. Do we know anyone that has had a child at 65 years old? And this is just when God has made the promise. And this actually comes to pass. You probably know the story. Sarah was 90 years old when she has the child. And so you can imagine the feeling of impossibility. Abram questions God in 15. Abraham says, Lord, what will you give me, seeing I go childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Then Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. And verse 4, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. So God is saying, you're not going to have an adopted child. You're not going to have somebody you have raised that's going to be a descendant and your heir. It's going to be someone that comes from your own body. It's going to be a child that Sarah gives birth to. And again, we're looking at the age, and Abram is probably going, God, how is this possible? Then, in verse 5, then he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said, so shall your descendants be. And Abram at that time, it says, and he believed in the Lord, and he, God, accounted it to him for righteousness. I believe at this time was when Abram believed God, that God was going to be able to fulfill this great promise. He didn't understand how, but he believed him at this time. At this point, I want to mention something that brings into the realm of discussion here, this innumerable amount of descendants. You've got the Jewish people that you could maybe get a count on if you trace the tree back. But God's adding a little something here. If we just, and I couldn't spend much time on explaining this, but in Revelations chapter 7 and verse 9, I want to read this to you. After these things, I looked. Now this is John describing what he sees in Revelation. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, all the nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robe and palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Now this right here is just a little short piece that I want to throw in here about how God uses and how God is in the very beginning, when in chapter 12 where God said that he would use through Abraham, he would bless all the families of the earth. And so this is talking about this Revelation chapter 7 verse 9, where it sees all the multitudes of people that no one can number. Then that can be tied to this this in chapter 12 about all the families of the earth will be blessed. But not only that, but the descendants that no one can number, because through Christ, that's going to come through this offspring that's going to give all the families of the earth an opportunity to be saved and become part of this family that God's promising right here. That's just amazing and mind-blowing to me, but I'm going to have to skip ahead and really attempt to get through here. But how is this going to happen? Because there still was no child. But Abram is thinking, well, what have I got to do here? I got to do something. I mean, God, I got to have a child. So I want to read here in verse 15, this thing called, there's a covenant that was known in the Old Testament called the cutting covenant. And right here in verse 7, I'll start reading there. Then he said, talking about God, then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit. And so God then says in verse 8, and he said, Lord, this is Abraham, and he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? So God says back to him, so he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought these to him and cut them in two down the middle and placed each piece opposite of each other, but he did not cut the birds in two. So this is a covenant that I'll just have to explain this. This is a covenant that that you would section up these animals, and you would put them kind of in this pathway, and parties that were agreeing on a subject or making an agreement or some kind of covenant, they would come together and they would pass through this kind of pathway or channel of cut up carcasses of these animals that's mentioned here. They would pass through, and it would signify this agreement to death. So if one of these parties were to break this covenant, then it was a sentence of death. And so Abram knew when God told him to do this, he knew that, okay, I'm going to sit back and we'll do this, and I'm going to wait on God to show up, and he's going to walk through this pathway with me, and we're going to have this agreement, and then God's going to give this child. Well, what happens next? If we read on, we'll skip down because of time. Abram falls asleep. He waits and waits, and it says that he drove away vultures that came to eat the carcasses and all. Nighttime was getting near, and evidently it was a long day, and so Abram got tired, fell asleep. Well, it says, if we skip down, it says that Abram had a kind of a vision. And I'm just going to read the last part of it in verse 17 of chapter 15, verse 17. And it says, in this vision, and it came to pass when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. And so that when you just read over that, it's easy to miss it. But what God is doing here, he's telling Abraham, he's saying, look, I got this. This is on me. I am going to fulfill this covenant, and you don't even hardly have a part in this. You just have to believe that I will fulfill it. This impossible task I will fulfill. I will walk through this, and I will sign this covenant to death even. And down the road, Jesus even died on the cross for this covenant. But that to me was just satisfying to my soul. When I saw that, I just feel like that's a great truth, that we can depend on God and trust in God. And I had some things wrote down here. The burden is not on us. The burden when we see an impossible task that God may ask us to do, it is not on us. God has already given us the means to complete that. That is going to be done through Jesus Christ. Our burden is not on us. It's wholly on God. 100% on God. What seems impossible to us, God will fulfill in a spectacular fashion. Trust Him for the impossible. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'm sure I went over on my time, but it's a really hard thing to describe. But I would challenge you to go and read Genesis chapter 12, and I think it goes on the story until the child Isaac is through 17, and probably even further than that. I read all this. I don't know where I quit reading it. 17, 18, 19, just to see the story of how God brought about the birth of Isaac, which is Abram's offspring, and brought about it was the birth of the nation of Israel. So I would challenge you to read that and remember what we talked about today. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.